That's the reality of the world that we live in, is actually things are continuously changing and moving and shaping. And what I always say, what I always teach, we are all co-creating the future, whether by inaction or action, whether by unconsciousness or consciousness. If we are unconscious of the fact that we are co-creating the future, then we're just perpetuating the agendas of other people who've set the course for us. If we choose to be conscious participants, then shape futures in better ways.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Friends, as you know, I have been very interested throughout this entire podcast and just in general in better understanding why all of the crisis, war, death, polarization, and disconnection is happening and what's the larger meaning for it as individuals, communities, a country, and as a people. And I'm constantly looking for explanations and reasoning and hope and meaning. Because of all of that, I'm really excited about today's episode. First, because we're speaking with someone who I love talking to, but also because today we are going to be exploring some really interesting and powerful spiritual and philosophical concepts from different faiths, traditions, and philosophies that I feel bring some really fascinating, meaningful, and hopefully maybe even hopeful perspective to what may be going on in the world and with this election and how we can contribute to that. So let me introduce you to our incredible guest today. We are joined by Ganga Devi Braun. She and I both attended One Spirit Seminary, and we actually know each other not because we were classmates, but because Ganga graduated in 2020, right before I began seminary. So she actually graduated. She was the first class graduating during COVID in June of 2020. And then I started in September of 2020 with my class, and she had signed up to be a mentor, and we were divinely paired up. She and I had so many amazing conversations throughout my schooling, and I feel really grateful for our connection and our continuing relationship. She has known for many years, may have been one of the first people that I told that I had wanted to start a podcast, and she was incredibly supportive. So it feels so amazing to now be here having her as a guest and having a truly interfaith and interspiritual conversation. So let me formally introduce you to Ganga. Ganga Devi Braun is a regenerative practitioner, advisor, and developmental partner to the leaders, nurturers, and visionaries shaping regenerative futures. Rooted in the land and waterways of the Ais people along the Treasure Coast of Florida, all of Ganga Devi's work comes from a practice of deep listening to the wisdom of the more than human world. She is an active member and graduate of the Regenesis Institute for Regenerative Practice, committed to the potent, emergent work of the many threads of regenerative cultural transformation. Ganga Devi works with founders and leaders in a range of regenerative movements and initiatives to support the integrity of this work at multiple levels of development. You can learn more about Ganga on her website at www.gangadevibraun.com. I'm going to spell that for you. It's also in the show notes. But just so you have it, it's GangaDevibraun.com. Ganga, thank you so much for being here and for joining me on the podcast. I'm so excited you're here.
Thank you so much, Devin. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so honored to be in this space with you. And I'm so proud to be a part of this arc that you've been on. And it feels like a really powerful full circle moment as well for me.
So before we get started on the topics and these amazing things that we're going to talk about, could you please explain for me and for all the listeners, what does the term regenerative mean?
Yeah, absolutely. There can be different definitions and different ways of approaching what that word means in different applications. But at the heart of it all, it's really about aligning with the life, death, life cycle that is inherent to all living systems, to all of reality, really. And we live in a world that has been profoundly degenerative, ironically, because we live in a world that's been shaped by this Western colonialist, capitalistic initiative and vision of basically trying to escape death completely, by trying to deny that death is real and trying to create infinite economic growth and infinite growth of empire and infinite growth of, one's own ability to gain power and wealth and avoid death as much as possible. This is what, so many kings and leaders and oligarchs and billionaires and everything are obsessed with. And ironically, it's this cultural sickness that is so oriented toward life at all costs that it has completely denied death. And by denying death, it has become a death culture, a culture that is degenerative to life and destroys life for the sake of trying to accumulate as much life and as much power for the few as possible. So we live in this larger degenerative culture where we've forgotten how to live as living systems, the way that all natural living systems actually operate, which is through the dynamic harmony of the life, death, life cycle. So if you look at regenerative agriculture, so much of regenerative agriculture is about allowing cycles of decay to support the sequestration of carbon into the soil and to restore and regenerate the health of soil, which, we all know that our food is less nutritious than it was a generation ago because of our agricultural practices are extractive and degenerative to the integrity and the nutrition of the soil. But that's not the way that nature works. And the way that nature works is that if allowed to thrive over time and in the natural cycle, forests, grasslands, prairies, every kind of ecosystem actually stores carbon, stores nutrients, grows in its biodiversity, in the nutrition that's available to it. And, regenerative agriculture is one of the main ways that people are learning about regeneration, because if you go to Whole Foods, you can buy regenerative eggs. You can buy, food that's grown. That's way more expensive.
I didn't actually know that. Okay. Yeah. Got it. Cool. I'll look for that. Yeah.
But that's something that a lot of people are initially exposed to, but actually the field of regenerative organizational and systems design has its roots in, over the course of the last few decades, there have been some specific lineages of thought, especially founded by Carol Sanford, who had her grandfather, I believe he was Mohawk, and he taught her these very, very core principles of the way that life cycles work that are very rooted in Indigenous wisdom. And if you look to so many different sources and forms of Indigenous wisdom. And I know you had Pat McCabe on recently, who speaks so powerfully about this. There's so much wisdom in Indigenous knowledge systems that is essentially what regenerative cultural shift is all about. And the idea of regeneration can be applied to every form of business, every form of land project, every form of culture making. They can be brought into our own families and the way that we relate to ourselves and our personal development work. It can be brought into our spirituality. This is the way that we actually can and must live if we're going to have life on this planet. And it's not something new. It's a remembrance. We're reconnecting with ourselves and our true nature and the wisdom of the living world. And we're moving forward into a regenerative future. And it's going to take all of us. It's going to take every industry. It takes everything. And I'm in it for the very long game. I'm in it for the multi-generational game.
We definitely need to do another podcast episode to learn a lot more about this, because it sounds so fascinating and it feels so relevant and related to what we were talking to Pat and Cape about a week ago. She has a lot to share about the medicine wheel and how the degeneration of that is affecting all of us. And so obviously moving into regeneration is so powerful. And it also reminds me a lot, I feel so drawn to Indigenous practices and traditions and teachings, but also other earth-based teachings, including like paganism and the Celtic Wheel of the Year, which I feel so drawn to in terms of our bodies and systems moving through the cycles of the earth. So like you're talking about, like things need to actually decompose in order to then have good soil, rich soil that things can grow in. And I think that is what keeps us alive, is following the cycles that we're meant to follow, but we have sort of decided that we are better than the cycles and can sort of overcome them with electricity and other things.
And our minds have done that and our culture has done that, but our bodies are regenerating all the time. That's how we're alive. That's how everything works.
So obviously everybody, Ganga Devi is so fascinating. And she has a lot to share with us. So we will hopefully have her back on the podcast. But today we have a lot of ground to cover because she has really, really fascinating insights into a lot of different concepts that are from different faith traditions, from different philosophies, from different backgrounds. She's incredibly well read and studies a ton of different things and is involved in a ton of different things. And so we're going to be covering 4 different concepts, sort of 5. The first is Jewish and is actually 2 concepts, which I said sort of 5, and they are very related. They are Tikkun Olam and Tikkun HaNefesh. And the second is the Buddhist concept of Bodhichitta, which is very related to Tikkun HaNefesh. We will then cover the spiral dynamics and integral theory popularized by Ken Wilber. And then finally, Ganga will share with us some really fascinating insights from a theory called the Strauss-Howe generational theory that is explained in the book, The Fourth Turning. So we clearly have a lot to cover. So Ganga, let's dive right into these concepts. So Tikkun Olam, I know about, and Tikkun HaNefesh, you are introducing me to. I have been drawn to Tikkun Olam since I learned about it in seminary, and I understand that it is the idea of the repair of the world. And I'm not going to even try to explain the concept because you're going to do a much better job. But I do want to share that I recently heard this quote, and it's made me realize that I think it actually is talking about Tikkun Olam and Tikkun HaNefesh. And I might be saying that wrong also. So please correct me when you explain it. So in the 1800s, Menachem Mendel Schneerson wrote, "If you see what needs to be repaired and how to repair it, then you have found a piece of the world that God has left for you to complete. But if you see only what is wrong and what is ugly in the world, then it is you yourself that needs repair."
Yeah.
I mean, that quote alone, regardless of the fact that it's about Tikkun Olam, it just feels so powerful. And so can you share with us what is Tikkun Olam? And then, because it's new to me and everybody, well, most people that will be listening, what is Tikkun HaNefesh, if that's even how you say it?
Yes. Well, first, actually, I love this quote. I've never heard that quote before. And I love it because it actually ties perfectly into a core principle in regenerative practice, which is that we start from potential rather than problems. And that's exactly what is being said in this quote, is that if you see what is wrong with the world and a way to repair it, then it is your responsibility. But if you only see what is wrong with the world, then there's some healing that needs to happen for you. And it's a core thing that many of us have to unlearn when we enter into regenerative practice. We're so trained to look for problems. And no one ever talks about the fact that things are actually coming together and going right often. So the way that it was taught to me is that at the beginning of the universe, there was a totality, there was a completion, there was a unification of all of reality. And that part of creation as we experience it was the breaking of the vessels, that it was all of reality and all of divinity was held within these vessels in space, and that something happened to crack the vessels. It was first taught to me as a child. I had this visual of mason jars of light, and that the mason jars cracked open and the light scattered. And that was the creation of the universe. And that our task as incarnated beings is to bring the pieces back together, is to repair the wholeness of the world and of reality, and to know that we will not see the completion of that work in our lifetime. It is very likely, but that it is our responsibility to contribute to it. And so
this is a Jewish concept or Jewish teaching, correct? Yeah. And it's sort of a more mystical Jewish teaching, right? So is it more related to Kabbalah, or like, how does it sort of fit into Judaism?
Yeah. Well, so Kabbalah is not like one unified school of thought. There are many different branches of Kabbalah. And actually I have an amazing person that I think would be awesome to have on
cool.
my Kabbalistic teacher, Dr. Yosef Rosen, and he's absolutely brilliant. And we've learned so much from him. And he teaches like practical Kabbalah and historical, and he's amazing. I'm not even actually personally all that certain of the specific origin of the concept of Tikkun Olam. It's just been a part of my understanding and my cosmology, actually since I was quite young, because I was raised in an interspiritual community. Yeah. And so it was actually from Yosef that I first learned of this kind of parallel concept of Tikkun HaNefesh, which is the repair of the soul. And it's interesting because you said, it's a mystical concept. And I would say, yes, I think that that's true. But what's interesting is that a lot of Jewish people have taken it, including a lot of people who are not mystical, who would not identify as being mystical Jews, but they have taken it as a lot of people who are actually secular but identify culturally as Jewish, because Judaism's not really a religion. It's an ethno-religion. And so you can identify very strongly with your Jewish culture and with your Jewish heritage and with your Jewish identity and not really have a mystical or religious bone in your body.
We covered that with Rabbi Salem Pierce. It was super fascinating to learn about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And with that, a lot of people have taken Tikkun Olam as something that is just like an ethical and a political imperative, And so it's like not even connected to the mysticism of it, but just being like, my ancestors cared about Tikkun Olam. And I care about Tikkun Olam, and I care about the world because I live in it, because I belong to it. I don't have to have a concept of God or the divine to care about the common ground that we all live within. So there's so many different ways that people interpret and relate to Tikkun Olam. There are like infinite ways that people practice Tikkun Olam in their own lives. And it's a beautiful thing to connect with and to talk about. And if somebody's like listening and maybe like you have Jewish friends, but you never really talk about Judaism because you don't really know how, like, it can be a beautiful thing to like ask them, like, do you connect with the idea of Tikkun Olam, and how do you? Because so many people do really personally. And I think a lot of Jews often feel somewhat isolated. Like, I think a lot of Jews are like, would like to have conversations about meaningful aspects of Judaism with people in their lives. But a lot of people don't know an entry point, and this can be a really beautiful entry point.
So cool. So what does Tikkun Olam, how do you relate to it? Just as an example, like, how do you practice it? How do you relate to the idea?
Yeah, well, so this just kind of effortlessly brings us into the second topic, which is Bodhichitta. So in my childhood and my upbringing, the ideas of Bodhichitta and Tikkun Olam, although they are distinct concepts, they have always been entwined in my life. And when I first met, I'll share about Bodhichitta and what that means. Yeah. And then I can kind of talk about how I see them being just completely interwoven within me. A lot of people have heard the term Bodhisattva, maybe because you listen to the Beastie Boys. Like, it's like, it's in the culture, right? And so I think some people think of like, okay, is a Bodhisattva like a person, or is it like a saintly figure? Do you become a Bodhisattva? For anybody who's new to this idea, a Bodhisattva is the most common way of describing it in our culture is somebody who has made the commitment to not reach enlightenment and then just like tap out of reality and of the incarnation cycle, but someone who has made the commitment to reach enlightenment and continue reincarnating in order to support the liberation of all beings.
And this is a Buddhist concept.
This is a Buddhist concept, yes.
Heads up.
Yes. So that's the way that a lot of people think about it. But in Buddhism, all of life is suffering. And so you're just like committing to coming back and suffering again and again and again until everybody's liberated from suffering. That sounds awful. I think that's how some people like take it, of just who would want that? If you could escape suffering, like that's what we would do. But the path to become a bodhisattva, it's not a martyr. I feel like martyrdom is something that's really strong in Christianity and in Islam. That's not the vibe of the bodhisattva path. The bodhisattva path comes from Bodhichitta. And Bodhichitta is the motivation that brings you onto the path of the Bodhisattva. And it's the motivation to achieve enlightenment, not for your own sake, but for the sake of all beings. And Bodhichitta naturally arises when you realize that you are not separate from all beings.
Yes.
And so it's actually the most natural and beautiful, spontaneous arising of clarity that my liberation depends upon the liberation of all. And there are a lot of people who are totally secular who feel that very deeply. I think that anyone who studies interdependence or who studies social systems or who just allows your heart to crack open to the reality of our radical and complete and total interdependence of all who live on this planet, of all life that ever has been, that ever will be, that ever is right now. When we allow ourselves to actually crack open to the radical interdependence of reality, then you can't help but see anyone suffering as an extension of yourself. And you can't help but long for the cessation of suffering of not only yourself, but everyone. And so you have this natural motivation that arises to help everyone, to love everyone, to serve everyone. So Bodhichitta is the motivation and Tikkun Olam is the process. And to me and my husband, Seth, they're just completely intertwined. And they're our core motivation. If people ask us, like, what is your core values of like your business? Like we say, Bodhichitta and Tikkun Olam, you know, what are the core principles of your marriage? Bodhichitta and Tikkun Olam. Like what drives you as individuals? Bodhichitta and Tikkun Olam. It's just we're very consistent.
And how does Tikkun HaNefesh interact with both of those? Because Bodhichitta is more related to like self-enlightenment for the liberation of all. And then Tikkun Olam is much more broad. It's about bringing but HaNefesh feels like it's repair of the soul. And so explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So Tikkun HaNefesh, I think that Yosef and more formal Jewish scholars, I'm sure, would have a lot more interesting things to say about this. But my own personal interpretation and the way that I relate to it is just, it keeps me humble, right? If I am continuously remembering that a part of my task is to repair my own soul, then I attend to that. Then I don't kind of assume that I know best and that like I'm already complete. But I also don't go in the other direction of thinking like, you know, oh, I'm just wounded and a piece of crap. And like, I'm just gonna like always be broken, you know, and it's so easy for our ego to oscillate between grandiosity and total like despair. We all can go through that. But Tikkun HaNefesh is like a reminder of like, okay, I've got work to do to repair my own soul. And I need to make sure that I'm continuously working on that line of development as I'm also looking toward our larger systems that we're a part of as well.
And so is it based in the idea that, you know, you were talking about these mason jars, which I love that visual, right? So it's the mason jars that are the light sort of scatters. Is it the same idea with like, that's how the universe was created? Is it the same idea that that's what happens with our souls when they incarnate, is that they're scattered and it's our job to go and find the pieces of light and bring them back into the jar and tape the jar up with duct tape? Like, is that the idea of Tikkun HaNefesh? I mean, I love these visuals, but I'm also like, what does that actually mean in practice? With both of them. Yeah.
I would say so. And I think that the journey of each of our lives that we've incarnated into, you know, have these like tasks for us to do. I think that sometimes life does feel a little bit like a scavenger hunt and we don't even have the list that we're looking for, but we know when we found one of the things. We return to a part of our authentic self. We feel our soul coming back alive with ourselves, you know? And again, Seth and I both have done a lot of study and practice in the field of trauma resolution. And we study trauma, you know, very, very much. And our belief is that when you hold a newborn baby, you see the wholeness that they are. You see their soul. It's like just kind of radiating from their eyes and their being. And then there's like layers of obscuration that come on through having a name, through the trauma of separation, the trauma of birth, even. Like there's these subtle traumas. And our, the definition of trauma that we work with is anything that's too much, too fast, or too soon for the nervous system to process, or just simply undigested experience. And our lives are full of those kinds of things.
Totally.
But then when we go out into the world and we find the people, we find the schools of wisdom, we find the places that speak to our soul, that help us come back to ourselves, that help us drop and process and metabolize and feel safe enough to come back to our wholeness a little bit, we're able to resolve some of those traumas piece by piece, and we come back into our wholeness. And I would say that is a central part of the process of Tikkun HaNefesh. And we can talk about it from like a scientific nervous system perspective. We can talk about it from a mystical perspective. And I think every mystical tradition has different language that can point us toward that same process.
That's helpful because it helps me to understand how in practice you see the Tikkun HaNefesh working. But then I'm curious with the Tikkun Olam right now. Tikkun Olam is the concept that I've been so drawn to and so curious about in terms of what's going on in the world. Like it feels like those pieces of light are incredibly scattered right now. And so I guess what I'm curious about is, what do you see as someone who feels drawn to and has grown up with this concept of Tikkun Olam and Bodhichitta? And what do you see going on in the world as it relates to these concepts and even the election?
Yeah. I can't answer that question without tying in the next concept that we're going to explore, which is integral theory and spiral dynamics. And so for anyone who is unfamiliar with these terms, they can be quite like a dense thing to dive into, but I do recommend it. I think it's incredibly insightful, but it's a lot to chew on. We're not going to go into all of it right now.
No.
But, so spiral dynamics is a map and a model of collective human evolutionary consciousness that makes a lot of sense when you study it. And it tracks the spiral of development that humanity has been on. One of the things I really always want people to understand if they study it, it's not hierarchical. It's not saying that, oh, when you're at the bottom of the spiral, you're bad or you're worse. It's just being like, this has been the developmental arc. And the reality is that all stages of the spiral, and they're all indicated by different colors as like a kind of a shorthand for describing the overall arc of each of them. We're not going to go into that, but
everybody, if you really want to dive into it, I will put some resources on the webpage and on the show notes. So yes. So the colors, it's not hierarchical, but it is about this spiral. Yeah.
And so if you can look at any point in human history and you can identify what was the emergent theme, or it's actually where the term meme came from, of a mental gene. It actually came from spiral dynamics, I believe.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that the origins of the word meme came from that. What was the dominant meme or the dominant emergent meme that was coming on the scene that we most primarily associate with that particular stage of history? And this is the thing, is that the spiral continues to develop.
Right.
Humanity is continuing to evolve and develop. And there's always 2% of the human population that's like at the vanguard of something that 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now is going to be more mainstream. And then there's also going
ahead of the curve, if you will.
Yeah. And then there's always going to be a large swath of the population that's kind of in the same arc together. And then there's going to be different segments of the population that are operating at different points of the spiral. And, and so there's going to be people who are operating in a much more authoritarian way. There's going to be people who are operating in a much more like tribalistic way. There's going to be people who are operating in a much more like logic way.
Because those are parts of the spiral.
Yes, because all of those are different memes in the spiral and different ways of being. And the reality is, all parts of the spiral exist within all of us. And to go back to your question, I really see this election as an opportunity for some significant movement on the spiral. And it's either going to bring us up the spiral, like into the next iteration, or it's going to really degrade us backwards. And I have to believe, but it's not just belief, I'm taking action every day, that we will move in the direction of forward on the spiral. I see Kamala Harris as being somebody who is really continuously doing the work to take broken systems that we have all inherited. We're all living in and swimming in oppressive waters that are incredibly messed up. And none of us created these waters, but we're all swimming in them. And when I look at the facts of her life and her career, and not just like things that I've heard, but like I look at the facts of it, I'm like actually incredibly impressed at the needle that she has threaded in so many different ways to try to truly serve and advocate for as many people as possible, as many vulnerable people as possible, and to serve as many people as possible in really challenging institutional settings that have been very hostile to her entire life. And the more I learn about her, the more impressed I am, and the more excited I am at the prospect of her presidency. And for me, nothing is about perfection. It's about integrity. And integrity is very different than perfection. And I think that perfection is often the enemy of integrity. But I see the prospect of her presidency being something that can really bring us forward in a really powerful way. But it makes sense that such a significant and timely and called for movement forward is so challenging and enraging to the old paradigm.
Got it. Okay.
And to old power systems that are really trying to continue their structures of power and control.
That part of like the spiral dynamics and integral theory, that there's a force that pushes against change or forward movement into the spiral, or like the elevation versus the degradation that you were talking about.
I'm sure that Ken Wilber would have some interesting things to say about that, but I'm not sure exactly what he would say about it. That's kind of just like my own perspective. But it's also like, if you think about and you look at the agenda of the people who are actually backing Trump right now, because he's just like this puppet that these tech oligarchs are trying to prop up in order to create this like theocratic technocracy that they know that massive change is happening, and they want to destroy all of our institutions and take control and like eradicate the Constitution and all of these things.
Right.
And it's so funny because it's like, when you look at that, you're almost like, oh, Kamala Harris wants to like preserve institutions. Like, is that actually maintaining the status quo more? But it's like, no, if you actually look at her policies, she's trying to create the conditions for greater opportunity for as many people as possible, so that collectively all of us can be what produces the collective change that is called for at this time. That's the way that I see it. She's trying to create the conditions of safety, stability, well-being, economic viability, all of these things, so that we together can shape what the future of this country and of the world looks like, rather than just giving away all of our power to accelerationists who want to have a civil war and destroy all of our institutions and then rebuild it in the image of Catholic Silicon Valley. Like, it's like the weirdest thing ever, and really hopefully does not happen.
Obviously, we could go down a rabbit hole here, but one of the things that comes up that I think is so important that you just mentioned is that it's not about perfection, right? Throughout this podcast, throughout, listening to people, learning from people, I've really noticed that there's definitely a trend of people being like, well, I'm not like, I don't love all the options, like whatever, right? I really appreciate what you've said, because I know that you've done your research, because you always do your research, really looking at her policies and how she's treated people and how she's led and all of these things. And like, yes, I think she will be, let's put it that way, inheriting a broken system and a messed up system, right? And so that's the hard part. But I come back to this thing that I actually saw even before I started the podcast months ago. And it was Brittany Packnett Cunningham, I think is her name. She had this quote about, I'm not looking for the perfect candidate. I don't expect anybody to make everybody happy, but I am looking for the most useful candidate that can move forward the change that I think needs to happen. And that is absolutely Kamala Harris, without a doubt. And I think what you're saying is like, that will move us also forward on the spiral of evolution and growth and forward movement in the history of humanity and our country.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I love, there's a Rebecca Solnit quote that voting is a chess move, not a love letter. And I really love that as well. And yeah, it's like voting sets the ground from which we have to operate. And to me, way more than whoever's in the executive
yes,
seat.
Of course.
To me, it's about judges. It's about the judicial branch so much. And it's so many other things. I happen to personally really like Kamala Harris.
Yes, I do too.
And I
With
understand
the exception
why,
of a couple things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand some of why, I understand different elements of policy of like why some people wouldn't. But personally, she checks all of my boxes, and I feel grateful for the work that she has done in all of the offices that she has held so far. Yeah. And I really, really hope that she has a chance to serve in this office that is like so messed up. The presidency is like, I mean, I've had conversations with people about like one day it would be amazing to abolish the presidency, but like this is a system that we have right now. And I hope she's in it.
I know. Same. So the final concept that we are going to talk about tonight that you introduced me to is from this book, The Fourth Turning. It's the Strauss-Howe generational theory, which I think is so fascinating that you first told me about. So can you explain to the audience what this is and why it's relevant, especially with this election?
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea of the fourth turning is that there are these like meta cycles that happen in Western civilization. And it's 4 different cycles that repeat that are generally about 20 to 30 years. So in the course of a person's lifetime, you may experience all of them. And each one of us, the reason it's called like a generational theory is that, each one of us is born into a certain stage of the cycle. And it's going to be a different stage of the cycle than our parents were born into. And so it can help us understand actually the differences between generations and why sometimes we don't understand the generations, that maybe 2 or 3 generations that came before us. But actually, if we look back to like 100 years ago, we're like, oh, those people are going through something similar. Like I kind of vibe with that, people who, for me, it's like people who came of age in like the 20s, and in the aftermath of a massive pandemic and in like this huge cultural renaissance and like this expansion of what is possible and like sexual liberation and all kinds of things like that. Like you can actually track and understand yourself more in a larger historical context by studying this. And so the 4 cycles are a high, which occurs after a crisis. That's going to be the last one. Then an awakening, then an unraveling, then a crisis, then a high, then an awakening, then an unraveling, then a crisis. So I think that it's pretty clear to most of us that we've been living in a crisis. And there's different opinions on when the crisis began. I think that 9/11 was definitely a significant moment of the beginning of this crisis. Some significant moments of this crisis have included the 2008, economic crash. I mean, the fact that we've just been in perpetual war.
Right.
It's just like a war that, because it's not where we live, it can be easy to forget that since 2001, there's just been continuous war in the Middle East that the United States has been a part of, and massive collective trauma and things that are, still happening and escalating in different ways. But like, there's like a legacy of that arc that has been happening. But then, also, the economic crash, the pandemic, and climate change. I mean, there's so many different layers, and we have the language for it now of the polycrisis. We're living in the polycrisis. It's many different forms of crisis unfolding at once. And it can be very easy to imagine that, to think of it as like something that's only going to escalate and never going to end. And in many ways, I think this is probably a common critique of this theory, which is just because a crisis ends for some people doesn't mean that it ends for everybody, like racism and climate change. And there are certain aspects of horrific circumstances that continue even when certain dominant aspects of the cycles seem to be wrapping up. But it's always moving. Things are always changing. And that's the reality. That's the reality of the world that we live in, is actually things are continuously changing and moving and shaping. And what I always say, what I always teach is like, we are all co-creating the future, whether by inaction or action, whether by unconsciousness or consciousness. If we are unconscious of the fact that we are co-creating the future, then we're just perpetuating the agendas of other people who've set the course for us.
Right.
If we choose to be conscious participants, then we can shape futures in better ways. And so within this framework of the fourth turning, like, it's undeniable we've been in a crisis. We're in a crisis. And for a lot of this year, before Kamala Harris actually took on the mantle of this election, I think like a lot of people, we were just kind of, oh my God, I don't think that we're going to be able to generate the energy. It seems that Trump is gaining the energy behind him. Mm-hmm. And there was kind of this like dread, anxiety of just like, okay, we've been in crisis. We're in crisis. It's just going to get worse. I know that for a lot of Jewish people, the alarm bells have been going off in our body well before October 7th of rising anti-Semitism and the sense of like, are we in the equivalent of 1930s Germany? Is anti-Semitism going to escalate so much worse than we thought it might in our lifetime? And that fear is still very much alive in so many people and many different types of people, that things could get a lot worse. And I think that if Trump does become president, that will be true, and it will be horrific, and it will be fascistic. And I don't think that any of us can even conceive of how bad it actually could get with the groundwork that's been set with the Supreme Court. And the circumstances of our institutions are a lot different than they were in 2016. And the people surrounding him are a lot different than the people who were surrounding him before. It's just like a different situation, and it could be a lot worse. So this like massive anxiety of like the crisis is about to get so much worse has been like moving through my body through so much of this time. And as soon as I knew that Biden was going to step down a couple of weeks before he actually did, because I follow people on Instagram who are like Democratic Party insiders. I recommend everybody follow the wellness therapist on Instagram. She's really, really interesting person to follow. She's an Iranian therapist in California, and she knows a lot of people in the Democratic Party, and she calls everything really spot on. So I was prepared, and I was like, it's going to be announced any minute now. Like, I knew it, and I felt the anticipation build inside of me because I had kind of the time to think about what would this mean, and I could feel the energy that would be unleashed. And it felt really, really good. And when it did happen, that fateful Sunday, it was like a lightning bolt of energy through my body. And as she's come out with her policy proposals, what I just feel so much is that this can be the marking of the end of the crisis. Not that a lot of key aspects of the meta crisis and the poly crisis that we're in are going to completely magically disappear, but climate policies, economic policies to make it more possible for our elders and our children to be cared for so that we can have our own creativity and our businesses and like our ability to shape our worlds and our communities and our destinies unlocked, helping the housing crisis. Like, there's so many things that are really, really smart that she wants to have the opportunity to address. And if we can deliver her the Senate and the House and the presidency, I think that we're going to usher in a really actually powerful new high. And it's during the high of the cycle of our civilization that a lot of cultural transformation happens. And we need massive cultural transformation.
Yes, we do.
We really, really do. And I think that it's possible.
Yeah. And looking at these cycles that you're talking about, so there's the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis within this theory. And the crisis, part of what I'm looking at this PDF that I will include in the show notes, it says, however, as this period ends, institutions will be rebuilt. Society will rediscover the benefits of being part of a collective, and community purpose will take precedence again. And then a high, which follows the crisis that ended the previous cycle, is a period typified by strong institutions and social collectivism and weak individualism, which is amazing. We love that idea. So that's really powerful, and it's very hopeful, right? So it's always interesting to me, and this is why I wanted to talk to you about these concepts, because it's interesting to look at theories. And we talked to an astrologer last, and that was super helpful. And I know you know about that with Pluto, and to understand like what is going on here, and is there any hope? Because I think so many people have been feeling more and more hopeless, so less and less hopeful, right, over time. And the same with you. I was like, oh my gosh, I feel hopeful all of a sudden. And it's like, okay, but can I feel hopeful? Like, what is going on here? So with this, it's helpful to understand in this paradigm with generational theory that it would be about us moving from a crisis to a high, which I love that idea. Yes, please. And then in terms of the spiral dynamics, you're saying that it is about us moving forward, like going up a rung on the spiral, which would be amazing as well. Yes, please, let's make it happen, right? That's not just prioritization. And I also am wondering, in terms of Tikkun Olam, what is the significance of this election and this sort of crisis period that we're in when it comes to the concept of Tikkun Olam, which you've explained that Tikkun HaNefesh and the Bodhichitta are both very related to it, but the concept of Tikkun Olam is about the repair of the world. And so how is this election and this space that we're in the world and in this country related to the idea of Tikkun Olam?
Yeah. I mean, I think that this question is a good opportunity to step out of the partisan dynamic of it's funny, I'm thinking about right now, the weekend after the election in 2016, I remember so vividly because it was my first ever nonviolent communication workshop. I was spinning out because naively, I didn't think that white supremacy was so strong in this country. Right. And I see his election then, and I see his electorate now as being just so tied in with how deep white supremacy is in this country. And I'm so grateful that I had that training that weekend because I had a breakthrough in it, which for anyone who's not familiar, nonviolent communication was created by Marshall Rosenberg, who's a brilliant, brilliant man. And one of the core pieces of understanding nonviolent communication is understanding that there are universal needs and always justified. We all have needs that need to be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. That weekend, I was able to actually get to a place of understanding MAGA people a little bit better and understanding that the core need to feel safe and to feel valued and to feel that your position in the world is secure, which, by the way, is a need that many people have been denied for way too long. The indigenous people of this land, the Black people of this land, many, 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 many immigrants of this land, people of all kinds of minority and marginalized identities, never in many cases feel that way, sometimes within their own communities, within the larger setting, all of that. And I would actually even say that most white people have never actually felt that level of dignity and care and value and true belonging that is, I believe, a core need of all of us. I mean, as a mother of a toddler, I've learned that there are two core needs that we all have, dignity and belonging. And I would say that most people in this world never experience true dignity or true belonging, but but a lot of white people experience a false sense of dignity and belonging because of what white supremacy gives us. Right. And so then when white supremacy feels threatened because we've had 8 years of a Black president who made everybody's lives better and who did a really freaking good job in terms of delivering healthcare and delivering a lot of good outcomes. That was terrifying and infuriating. And the rhetoric in the media, and that created this backlash of electing this false populist who doesn't give a shit about anyone, but who made people feel a sense of dignity and belonging.
Right. So how does this relate to Tikkun Olam?
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel that when I go into these processes of reflecting compassionately on the core needs of people who I have a massive aversion to, when I can practice curiosity, compassion, empathy, and again, not bypassing, not excusing bad behavior, but opening my heart to remembering that I am interdependent with all of creation. Again, this is tying in Bodhichitta, that I'm interdependent with them, that I seek their liberation just as much as I seek my own, and that of people who it's a lot easier for me to have compassion for and care for. That is the practice of Tikkun Olam for me. I want this person to win the election. It's very important to me. But then there's that broader, deeper dimension that's really important, which is not creating more other and being curious about okay, I'm in Florida. I've got a lot of MAGA neighbors. I'm afraid of them killing me if things get really bad. That is an actual thought process that I have multiple times a day. And I also have the thought process of, okay, how can I connect more with my neighbors?
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to do with this podcast, right? Is to help people to open up and have conversations and find common ground and to not create more division, but rather find, even if it's tiny little moments of connection, even within yourself, which is what you're talking about with both with Tikkun Olam and Tikkun HaNefesh. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the conversation and also understanding all of these concepts that are so related, that are spiritual, but also historical and political. And, they bring in all these different elements of what could be going on here and what we are a part of, but they also bring purpose and hope and meaning. And that's what I really appreciate about all of these ideas is like, how can we engage with this? Because it's not just something that we're going to sit by and it's going to happen. Like this may happen because of people. So we're a part of it and we're a part of that cycle and we're all interconnected. So thank you so much for sharing all of this, Ganga. Is there anything else that you want to share before we close up?
No, I think we've given enough to chew on.
Yes, there's plenty
There's
to chew on.
always more. Actually, this is what I'll share to end, which is, it's funny. Seth and I met on New Year's Eve between 2016 and 2017. And I remember it so vividly because it was, 21 days before the inauguration. I was so aware of how bad things could get. And they did get really bad. People will be like, oh, well, we survived, 4 years of Trump. And I'm like, a lot of people didn't. Like before the pandemic, like a lot of people didn't. There's a lot of policies and choices that came out of his administration that ended a lot of people's lives and that destroyed a lot of families. And there's irreparable harm that has been done. My prayer and my intention for the new year, and I just remember it so vividly, especially because my husband and I tell the story of how we met all the time. And it was a conversation that we had that night. My prayer for the new year, my intention was to be as effective as I possibly could. Learn how to be as effective as I could. And so much of who I am and how I've developed in the last 8 years has been, I think, the answer of that prayer, has been me getting really creative and finding incredible communities and schools of thought and people at the vanguard of, I think, human development and human potential and what our future can be, who are doing amazing work. And my prayer continues to be as effective as possible. And that is a prayer that I just want to transmit and say to anybody listening to this. May you find your way of being as effective as possible in realizing the potential that you see for this planet, for our species, for what we can be and do moving forward in this world. And know that there is so much that can and will change within our lifetimes. And let's be a part of shaping that change as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I love that. Well, you and I have been on quite a journey, Ganga. Yes, on this podcast episode, but also in general. Actually, Ganga and I were on a call on January 6th, 2021, which was a very interesting call. And so it feels full circle.
Hopefully closing the loop.
Hopefully closing that loop. It's the end of a cycle that we are in right now. Yes. So you can learn more about Ganga, everybody, on her website at www.gangadevibraun.com. And you can connect with her and her teachings on Substack, where her writings and podcasts are both hosted. It is called The Living World, and you can find that at gangadevibraun.substack.com. I will also link those in the show notes and on the episode webpage. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you found some hope, meaning, and purpose. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. If you like what you're hearing, please make sure to follow the show wherever you're listening, and also follow me on Instagram and TikTok at RevDev_The Connected Way for bonus content, clips, and updates. I believe that connection is our healing path forward as individuals and a collective. The goal of this podcast and all of my work with The Connected Way is to help you find and foster a connection to spirituality, self, others, and all that is. And there are a couple of ways that you can help move that needle. First, please share this podcast episode and any social media posts or ideas that you see on theconnectedway.com with your community, friends, and family, especially anything that particularly resonates for you or them. Second, this podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and the work of The Connected Way, there is a link to donate in the show notes, as well as on the website at www.theconnectedway.com/podcast. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaways from the show. What inspired you, surprised you, or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment or DMing me on Instagram, or you can always comment on the website. As always, you can find all the resources mentioned in the show notes where you're listening, or on the episode page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Thanks again for being here, friend. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.